Good evening. I'm Gretchen Crosby Sims, the Executive Director here at the Institute of Politics. Tonight we are delighted to welcome the leaders of two of Chicago's most effective community organizations for a conversation about the power of organizing, the art of organizing, and this moment in organizing. A special thank you to Heather McGee, who has served as an IOP Pritzker Fellow this quarter and knows a thing or two herself about organizing. I do want to mention a few upcoming events. On Friday, Michelle Norris, former host of NPR's All Things Considered, will be discussing her race card project, its legacy, and how it can help us understand American politics today. On Monday, November 25th, former Senator Heidi Heitkamp and former National Economic Council Director Gary Cohn will be having a bipartisan conversation about the future of Social Security. To learn more about these and other upcoming events, please go to our website at politics.uchicago.edu and sign up for our newsletter. We will, after the discussion, have questions from the audience. We'll have a microphone that I think is going to be over here, and we, as usual, reserve the first three questions to come from students. I'd like to ask you now to please make sure that your phones are on silent. If you need them, restrooms are downstairs. And here to formally introduce our guest is Rima Saleh. Rima is a fourth year from from South Carolina, I think, currently from Chicago, studying public policy. During her time at the IOP, she has served on the Chicago Style Events Committee and as the Politics and Identity Facilitator for the Leaders of Color Initiative at the IOP. This year, she is the Chicago Style Committee Chair. Please join me in welcoming her to the podium.
Hello, everyone. Organizations across Chicago work to address a full spectrum of community issues, from fair housing to prison reform and abolition, from environmental justice to LGBTQ+ health. Today, we're joined by two leading organizers and activists to learn about how they tackle day-to-day issues in organizing and what we can learn from the history of Chicago's grassroots movements. Joanna Malone is the executive director of the Kenwood, Oakland Community Organization, one of the oldest grassroots community organizations in Chicago dedicated to serving low-income and working families through mobilizing for equitable education, affordable housing, youth investment, and senior engagement. He is one of the leaders in the Obama CBA coalition to create a community benefits agreement for the Obama Presidential Center. He is also leading the Lift the Ban coalition to repeal the statewide prohibition on rent control and establish rent regulations in Illinois. Ameesha Patel is the executive director of Grassroots Collaborative and Grassroots Illinois Action, both affiliated nonprofits working to win racial and economic justice in Chicago and statewide. She works to educate and mobilize Illinois residents to fight for living wage jobs, public education, affordable housing, and public safety at the voting booth. Before her time there, she spent several years working with hospital employees, Head Start workers, and coalitions of community organizations fighting against school closures. And she also worked for several years in the Bay Area on arts-based violence against women programming. Our moderator is Heather McGee, Senior Fellow at Demos and Resident Pritzker Fellow at the IOP this quarter. Her work has had a profound influence on public policies and issues, ranging from achievements around consumer protections to pro-democracy reforms won in a dozen states and Washington, D.C. Thank you for joining us for today's event, and please enjoy.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. I'm so glad to be here and so glad to be a part of this conversation that is happening here and also is being recorded and I believe live streamed. That's fine. So we're being live streamed. And you know, I've had the real honor and privilege of being an Institute of Politics Fellow this quarter here in Chicago and engaging with over 100 students in seminars week after week about policy advocacy. This is an issue that I care a lot about, particularly policy advocacy that overcomes the structural barriers of inequality to win big changes in the lives of working people and low-income people. And I have been able to bring a bunch of speakers in for these seminars every week to talk about big fights around universal health care, around taking on Wall Street and Dodd-Frank, around reforming the credit card industry. This week we had someone talking about corporate campaigning, how you get a corporation to do what you want. And at its heart, we've talked about every single way that advocates try to move a big issue into the mainstream and into law. And the conversations, without question and without fail, keep coming back to the power of organizing. And what I've seen in my conversations with students who range from first years to public policy students at the Harris School, getting their master's, is a real desire to be activists for change right now, in whatever form that might be. So I am thrilled to be in conversation with two of Chicago's most powerful leaders. These people are people who have transformed the frustrations and struggles of people who are systematically disenfranchised from the political process in Chicago and in the region, and transformed those struggles and frustrations into collective power. And that's what we're going to hear about tonight, and I'm really excited about that. I think as any good organizer, I think the most important thing is to find out sort of who people are, where they come from, what motivates them, what guides them, what is your story. So I want to start with Joanna and just hear, how did you get into organizing?
Well, so first, thank you all for coming. Thank you, IOP, for the invitation. And I'm so thrilled to be on stage with Heather, a legend in this work. I tell people I fell into organizing as a young guy who went to public school in Maywood, Illinois, who had the opportunity to travel to other schools throughout the Chicagoland area, and was able to witness firsthand the disparity that existed. It just operated as a lens through which I began to focus more and more keenly on how the world operated. And I was able to take the experiences as a young guy growing up in Maywood and not just look at how the public schools were different, but how the grocery stores were different, how law enforcement treated us differently, how in almost every aspect of everyday life, my experience in Maywood was different than friends and family who lived in Chicago, and was different based on the neighborhood in Chicago they lived, and different from the Oak Park or River Forest suburb I was right next door to, et cetera. And it helped me realize over time, as I kept asking why things were like this, that the conditions I was experiencing was a result of decisions people made. Things didn't just happen this way, right? It wasn't that, okay, Maywood ended up this way, Austin ended up this way, Oak Park ended up this way. But it was through a series of decisions that were made over a period of time. And it helped me come to the realization that if decisions created these conditions, decisions could also reverse these conditions.
And what was the first issue that you organized around?
You're taking me back a bit. So funny story. I was in high school, and growing up in the early 90s, I'm 46. I like to think of it as a golden era of hip hop, so people
Certainly
can understand. My friends and I were trying to understand what it meant to be Black in America. And through that experience, we organized, poorly I should add, a boycott of a school cafeteria when they went up on the prices. I don't think the boycott lasted the full lunch period, but we did it. We also organized a Black student union at the high school. And so through some of that activism, the principal began to take notice, and we had a new superintendent of the school district. And there were budget cuts that were being proposed. Of course, a budget cut was going to hit our school the hardest out of all the other schools in the district. And so the principal began to take me on this dog and pony show to try to get parents to vote against the referendum. It was a ballot measure that was being introduced. And so we did that for months. The day of the election, I was passing, you stand out front of the polling place and give people a card saying, vote no. So I did that. I remember distinctly the very next day I ran to the store to get the newspaper because I wanted to see the results, and we lost. And it was a devastating feeling.
Yeah.
There was no process around trying to understand what happened, why we lost. The principal just kind of moved on with the rest of the school year, and I was, to some degree, left holding the bag, right? Just this feeling of loss, and not understanding all the work that went into it, why we didn't win. And I think somewhere that early loss is still there. I would like to say I don't like to lose. But it's one of those early experiences that did help to shape how I view what campaigns should look like, how to organize campaigns to win. You don't do it just to do it, you do it to win, to create a result. So, yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you for sharing this. So, Ameesha, same question to you. How did you get your start in organizing?
Yeah, I'm also really glad to be here with everyone today. For me, I was born in Chicago, but grew up out near O'Hare in a suburb called Elk Grove Village. And I grew up in a suburb at the time in the late 70s that was a new subdivision, like there were cornfields still across the street. It was new housing for newly middle-class families, mostly white. And what I wasn't ready for was the degree, and my family wasn't ready for, was the degree of racism and anti-immigrant oppression that we were going to experience. So, I think my parents, like many other immigrants, believed the story that gets sold to us of the American dream, and things are going to get better if out in the suburbs versus from living in the city. And what happened for me growing up was a huge amount of messages that said something was wrong with me and my family, and that was met in my family with silence. Like, we just did not have the tools to fight back against that, to contradict it. So it all went in me, and I grew up really being ashamed of who I was, of my family, wishing that I was white, like all of this kind of self-directed hate. And for me, it wasn't until I went to college where I learned language around oppression, and that it's not just that there was nothing ever wrong with me or my family, but it was racism and some degree classism as well. And that language then, and what's where I found organizing, was when I was able to convert my anger from being self-directed to being out into taking on the oppressions that I experienced, but that I saw happening, in communities everywhere. And it wasn't until my early 20s that I, kind of made the connection more deeply to my own family in terms of organizing and why I did this work. And that was, when I finally started to think about my mom, not just as my mom, but like as a worker and as a human. And I realized this woman had been working in this factory for over 25 years. And I had no idea what her experience was like. I had no idea what that context of her work was and who she was as a worker. And I finally went to work with her in my early 20s and was devastated by what I saw.
What kind of factory was it?
It was a metal finishing factory. So this is, basically after NAFTA, it ended up changing hands a few times and then shutting down. That's what NAFTA did. But the time that I went to work with her was a metal finishing company, and so literally she went from vat of chemical to vat of chemical, doing dunks and doing different processes of these metal parts. At that point, there were so many layoffs that she was one of only a handful of workers left. And what the workplace really reflected society, which is that the South Asian workers were all together, Latino workers were together, the Eastern European workers were together, the Black workers were together, and at that point, she was the last South Asian worker remaining. So then I asked her, who do you have lunch with? Who do you talk with? And she said, I mostly sit by myself, but sometimes my friend Mila is here, and then we'll sit together, because people sat by race in the cafeteria, even though there were only a handful of workers still left at that time. And she had no safety protections, no, I mean, you know, for me when I walk in, it's like a vat of smell of chemical, just like this wall of chemical hits me. And, you know, there were smells that I think she stopped smelling way early on in her time there. She was a member of she actually had a union. She was a member of a bargaining committee. She was on her bargaining committee because she was the one South Asian worker who spoke English. She learned English through me, so when I went through school, I lost my Gujarati, but she learned English. There's a whole complicated story of loss and gain and, you know, all of that. But what that meant is that when there were layoffs, she was one of the first people called back because she was on the bargaining committee. So, but at the end of after 25 years, she was still making about $9 an hour because the union basically was a handshake union with management. And so though she did have seniority, she did not have any real wage gains in over 2 decades of work. So she says, and she'll say to this day, that her bad union was better than no union. And it was a thread for eventually I got into labor organizing because I have a whole host of aunts and uncles who were in the factories who weren't in unions. And I thought, well, nobody's going to speak Gujarati as a union organizer and talk about workers' rights unless I learned workers' rights and brought that back to my family. So that's a piece of the story of how I got into this work. And certainly she and much of my family is what drives me in my fight to this day for fighting against income inequality, racism, anti-immigrant stuff, like all of the things that so many of us experience.
Beautiful. Thank you so much for sharing both of those stories. So let's come into the here and now. You are both leaders of phenomenal organizations that are building grassroots power, and in some cases political power, to win, you know, real victories and real change in the lives of people, like the students that you grew up with, like your family members and the people in her factory, like your mother's factory. What is the most important thing that you're working on right now, or the handful of really important things that are just top of mind, the big fights that you are taking on at the moment? Ameesha, why don't you start?
Sure, I think it's hard to pick the biggest one because there's so many fights. Like right now we're working on a $15 minimum wage ordinance in the city of Chicago, including tipped workers, which our mayor just came out against today. So there's a very active live fight happening around that. But I'd say the biggest fight for sure is the fight to win a progressive income tax. It's called the fair tax. This is going to be a ballot question in November 2020. And if we win it, it'll be about $3.5 billion in new money from the wealthiest people in our state to go to fund healthcare, human services, education, the things that public sector, public governments support. This is a campaign we've been working on for over a decade. It's the furthest we've never gotten to the point of being able to put this on the ballot. And there's a ton of work to do. It is not by any means an easy fight or a slam dunk that we're going to win this. Many similar campaigns, though they've been through different routes in different states, have lost, you know, because there's so much opposition and fear around taxes, right? I mean, there's just so much fear around taxes and mistrust. And so we have a lot of work to do to really be able to build the political demand for what is, you know, for winning this this ballot referendum. And it really, for us, is like not only kind of, I think, the biggest issue in my life as an organizer in Illinois, but I think also is just like sets us up for multiple other campaigns. Because the focus of Grassroots Collaborative is looking at the role, in particular the intersection of race and class, and really understanding how do we make sure that those who have the wealth are paying their fair share, whether it's wealthy individuals like in fair tax, or if it's CEOs and making sure that workers have good wages, but also fighting against subsidies, like all the places where we think, oh, there's no money for, we get told all the time, there's no money, there's no resources, we can't afford it. Even today in the budget meetings at City Council, someone was talking about how we all need, the shared sacrifice in this moment. And we all know there's not so much sharing of that sacrifice, and so our work is really about making those connections between corporate power, elected officials, and race, and really understanding how do we actually fight for the things that our communities not only need and deserve, but have the right to, and understand this as in a rights framework, things that now we're supposed to be so grateful for, that the little pieces that we have, in fact, used to be free when it was white people who benefited from those services or those opportunities. And now that it's a city of, when we're talking about Black and brown people, there are things that we have to keep fighting for and clawing for, like even just fractions of what used to be true for people in this country.
Great. So I want to come back to the fair tax, but first I want to hear what's big right now for Coco.
Sure. So as Rima mentioned, at the Kenwood Oakland Community Organization, really since 1965, when we were founded by community and religious leaders, there's been 4 areas of work that, unfortunately, 50 plus years later, we're still working on. So affordable housing, equitable education, youth investment, and senior rights. But together, particularly in this moment, we see our organizing as against displacement. And I say in this moment, but recognizing that gentrification is really a cycle that begins with disinvestment. And through the disinvestment, you create conditions to make it lucrative for a developer to come in and purchase low and sell high. And so we're seeing that moment now, where, I mean, you just look the last week, right? You've had multiple articles talk about the churning effect that speculators are having on housing market and communities in general. So 2 campaigns that we're currently involved in to address that, you mentioned rent control is one where there has to be regulation on rent. We get into this artificial argument about tenants versus landlords when it isn't about that at all. For us, when we look at the federal housing market and the money that Congress has appropriated to the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development for Section 8 vouchers or housing choice vouchers, the amount of money has doubled, where we're looking at a difference of somewhere around $5 billion to $10 billion in a 10-year period. During that same period, while billions of dollars are leaving our pockets, we have fewer families who are actually being housed. So $5 billion jump in terms of investment, 300,000 fewer families being housed. And the only reason that's happening is because rent is just continuing to go unchecked. So we are approaching a point, and not to sound overly dramatic here, but we are approaching a point where it's going to be virtually impossible to provide affordable housing for people if we don't do something now. This is something that in the 70s, conferences were being held to discuss. And so years later, we still haven't addressed this issue, and I would argue the reason is that the attention has been skewed. So it isn't about housing people, it's about how do you sweeten the pot so that investors are willing to put their private capital into these developments. And so if the attention is away from housing people and on how to put more money in the pockets of investors, we're going to continue to have a problem. So rent regulation is an important piece of that. The other one, again, you mentioned a community benefits agreement connected to the Obama Presidential Center. We've seen families displaced from Woodlawn and South Shore in particular, just from the announcement the Presidential Center was coming, right? Ground hasn't even been broken yet. And people are scurrying, trying to find some place where they can afford to rent because, again, real estate speculators have driven the prices up so much. We have people who have lived in Woodlawn for 40 plus years who are at risk of losing their homes because their property taxes have increased so much. So those are 2 things that's really critical for us right now.
Can I add something on just the point Joanna made around the focus is on investors and not housing people. One of the other big things that we're doing as an organization is suing the city of Chicago around its racist abuse of TIFs. So this is tax increment financing, public subsidy dollars that are meant for lowest income neighborhoods and communities in the city that instead go to places like Lincoln Yards, where almost $1.5 billion is slated to be handed over to Sterling Bay for infrastructure improvements, but also for PR, for people don't, the city will talk about, it's all about the bridges, but you look in the redevelopment agreement and there's all kinds of sweeteners and things thrown in there for Sterling Bay. And it's again, another example of where the city's priorities are not about, housing people, though they like to say Lincoln Yards is going to create all of this affordable housing. I'm sorry, if we had $1.2 billion directly for affordable housing would create a few more units than, the kind of the handouts that we're supposed to be grateful for as a gift for all of this money going to one of the wealthiest developers in the city. So it is, I think this comes true in so many different places, and our multiple organizations are really trying to take a different angle on it, because fundamentally this question of displacement in the city is huge. And we can get $1 billion or $3 billion from the fair tax, but if our people aren't living here anymore because of all of these policies, then who does that benefit, right? So, yeah.
Ameesha, you said something that I think is really important that we should pause on, which was, these kinds of benefits, when the recipients were white, were, given for free and without much political struggle. I mean, you didn't say that, but I'm adding this piece. And then, now it's different when the polity is more diverse. I don't think everyone knows the degree to which white middle-class wealth in the sort of, post-war period and throughout the 20th century was really subsidized. Can you talk a little bit about that? Like we're thinking of, we've got Lincoln Yards over here, which is, a big retail and commercial development that will also have housing that, is getting a lot of money in tax abatements from the city, and will have a little bit of affordable housing. And yet, and I'm a Chicago native, but I right now live in New York, where it's a very similar story. All of the affordable housing is done in sort of clawbacks from huge luxury developments. And you walk around the city and you just really realize that there's just no such thing as the creation of middle or working class housing anymore. It's all carve-outs of luxury condos, because luxury condos are the only thing that is being built all across 5 boroughs of New York City. But there was a time when middle and working class housing was being built, and it was being built and developers were being subsidized for that. And I just wonder if you want to elaborate on that point at all, about what it was like, and we do that so we can remember what it could be like again, what it was like when the government had a very different relationship towards the affordability and wealth building of its citizens.
Yeah, I mean, there's the example comes to mind that I've actually seen you talk about, which is this idea of how radical free college is, and that that's this this demand that is unrealistic, that is anyway, just pie in the sky, right?
It's a crazy socialist idea.
That's right. College. That's right. Thank you for saying it more clearly. That is exactly how it gets framed. And the reality that college used to be free when it was mainly white middle-class students going to college. And after the civil rights movement, when you started to see more black students start to begin to enter college, suddenly governments start defunding college, right? And that affects everybody, but it's racially motivated. And this idea, I think importantly in our organization, we're really been trying to move from talking about racism as a disproportionate impact, but actually talking about where racism is driving austerity and not just the result of austerity. And that's been a really important shift, because for me, organizationally, what we've had a very class-heavy analysis. It's meant that it's been an incomplete analysis around, and then therefore the solutions that we come up with aren't going to get us there if we're not actually understanding the role of race. But I'll say in terms of housing, I mean, this is, so what's in a place like Chicago, the only dollars that are there for affordable housing do come from these, sort of side side benefits from TIFs, these mega developments, and then, okay, well, and because of that, you'll get 10 or 20% set aside for affordable housing. Let's not talk about the fact that affordability, the measure of affordability is still totally off, and that the numbers is just outrageously tiny, right? It's like completely, and that's all feels very deliberate. It's not like, oh, well, that's just the best we can do. It's a choice that gets made over and over, and by the city itself when prioritizing our dollars to go to places like this. So when you have, there's very few exceptions, one of which is recently a project in Logan Square called the Emmett Street, which is 100% affordability from TIF dollars. And the challenge here is that the city is finding there's no pots in the city around building affordable units that are separate from TIF dollars. That is the main source of where affordable housing comes from. That is not how we should be funding affordable housing. And certainly when you have TIFs that just reinforce that where the biggest pots of TIF dollars are in the wealthiest parts of the city, which again is the contradiction of TIFs, that instead of helping reduce inequality, it makes it much deeper, because wealthy areas whose property values are skyrocketing have greater TIF dollars. So then they have even more money to spend on more development. Meanwhile, the lowest income neighborhoods in our city who have TIF districts have $0 in those TIFs, and why would a developer want to build there when they're getting over $1 billion to build in Lincoln Yards in Lincoln Park, one of the whitest, wealthiest parts of the city? So kind of answered your question, but
great.
But I think that's the reality of like what we're trying to kind of talk about, and with our leaders to really help. And part of the challenge is that we all believe that like, oh, that there's not more is not possible. Like there isn't more money. Like that, we hear that message all the time. And so our work to really like open up and help people really expand their idea of what's possible is so much of what our organizing is about. Because we can have this amazing, bold policy agenda, but nobody believes it's possible, then it's not going to really get there, right? And dealing with that discouragement and that hopelessness that gets reinforced from all different places is a key part of what our job is. And I think until we do that, we're not going to win. Like that's going to be a key part of what we have to do. And on our side, on the left, we have a much harder job than the right? Because we have to build a multiracial, multi-gender, multi-class, multi-regional movement that is saying yes to something, and our opposition just has to keep us divided and have us saying no.
All right, let's talk about organizing itself. First of all, how, and this is like not as sexy maybe as you know, other big topics, but how are your organizations structured? What do you actually do? Like lift the hood up a little bit for us, and particularly for the students. How does it work? How do you find people? What do they do when they become members and leaders? What's your theory of the case?
Sure. So COCO, for short, is individual membership-based grassroots organization. The core value within our organization is leadership development. Everything we do is about leadership development. So the idea is through the various campaigns, we come in contact with people, right? We operate canvassing efforts regularly. So we're knocking on doors, trying to have conversations with people. We're on the phones, phone banking, again, trying to have conversations with people. One example that might give some sense of how we operate in general is through our work of creating tenant councils. Okay. In subsidized properties, privately owned properties, there is a huge imbalance in the power dynamic between the landlord or the management company and the tenant, the renter. When tenants have the same issue, but they approach the management company individually, they often, I know it might sound crazy, but they're often ignored. People will go literally months, if not years, without having very simple, basic repairs done in their apartments. What happens when those tenants are able to band together is essentially create a union, right? Create some collective bargaining unit, and they go to the management company and or the owner en masse, they get a much different response. Yeah. And the fact that in federally subsidized buildings, tenant organizing is actually protected in the regulations, it adds just another layer of legitimacy, right? And so those tenants who begin to work together, to organize on their own behalf oftentimes become leaders within the organization. And what that means is they take on more and more responsibility in terms of driving the work of the organization forward. Connected to that is organizing training, right? The idea that there is a tool book or a toolkit by which people organize is simple and complicated at the same time. It's easy to say to someone, I need you to respect my rights, right? I need you to do the things that you've committed to do, right? I pay my rent, you make sure my apartment is livable, right? Pretty basic. But because management owners often have an incentive not to reinvest in a property, it takes a little bit more. And so that's some of the stuff that we're able to get into. We have an idea, borrowing from corporate America, of promoting from within. So for us, the goal is always to prepare people in a way that allows them to come onto the staff. If not come onto staff for the organization, be able to start their own organization to address issues that we may not be dealing with. So our entire structure is really, again, centered around this idea of leadership development, making sure that the community itself is stronger because of our presence there.
I imagine that some of you will have more questions about this, but Ameesha, will you talk a little bit about how it is that, who are your members, who are your leaders, how are you structured? There are 2 organizations, sister organizations. Talk about that a little bit.
Sure. Grassroots Collaborative is a coalition, so we're have a set of community organizations and labor unions. So community organizations include folks like Action Now, Brighton Park Neighborhood Council, Chicago Coalition for the Homeless, and then unions like the Chicago Teachers Union and SEIU Healthcare. Then we work obviously within a broader coalition, because 11 organizations alone is still definitely not enough in terms of the kind of power we need to build. So a lot of our campaigns are always larger coalitions. So one right now is called Reimagine Chicago, which has more like 20 organizations that are active and doing a set of work at the level of the city. Grassroots Illinois Action is our political organization. It's so our 501c4, and then we have a PAC as well. And for us, it's been really important to have multiple strategies, multiple vehicles to move multiple strategies. What we saw before we had a political organization was that we could wage these incredible campaigns. So Grassroots Collaborative runs campaigns that we can't win. That's what we do. At least not win anytime soon, right? Like we sort of look at like, what's the right fight to have that would open up and create space for other kinds of things to emerge. So one of those fights in the early 2000s was this campaign called the Big Box Living Wage Ordinance. This was when Walmart was trying to come into Chicago, have like 20, 30 stores come in at once. And we really decided, this is before I was on the board, but not on staff, and the decision was like having a site fight for 20 different Walmarts was going to be a total losing cause. So we created this ordinance called the Big Box Living Wage Ordinance, which said large retailers over, I think, 75,000 square feet would have to pay their workers a living wage. We won that, which was amazing, and then we won it with a veto-proof majority, and then Mayor Daley vetoed it and pulled off 3 votes, so we no longer had a veto-proof majority. So it was our first veto and only veto in Mayor Daley's history, because the council always did what the mayor wanted, and that's still kind of true today, right? But what it did was, that happened, that was in 2006, so 2007 were the city elections. And the living wage question was a key defining issue with when a bunch of progressive candidates campaigned on, a bunch of anti-living wage folks lost their races in that moment, but we certainly didn't win everything that we wanted to. Part of what we saw then was like, we can't just depend on like unions to do the electoral side while we do the issue side, because the unions don't have enough power, because if so, the city would look different. We'd be running the city in a different kind of a way. But how do we build community political power to add more power to what organized labor is doing? And so for us, that was critical to build our organization called Grassroots Illinois Action to start to build political power. And so on the issue side in Grassroots Collaborative, we decide things based on really kind of strategic planning processes with our member organizations. We do leadership development as well with the leaders of our member organizations, trying to cross boundaries of race and geography in the city and language, and bringing grassroots leaders across organizations and neighborhoods to be in real movement with each other. I think what we saw was, despite our name, Grassroots Collaborative, for many years, that's not what we were building. Like our leaders in the big box living wage fight, which was a 3-year fight, the same set of grassroots leaders come out over and over because they believed in the campaign. They could come out in the middle of the day for city council meetings. And after 2 years, our leaders actually had no relationships across t-shirt color, right? So like people stayed by t-shirt color. Like, so it was like, Action, or, back then it was Chicago Acorn, like their leaders were always together. We did nothing to actually build a real collaboration at the grassroots. And so that was like, so when I came on staff, it was like a key thing that was like, we have to change this. Like we are leaving so much of our power on the floor. Like we're not doing, this isn't organizing if we're not actually building the real power of grassroots leaders. So we've made a few different shifts. There's a lot to still figure out. I think our current question now is, do we need to have a way of organizing individuals directly into our organization? Because a model of just organizing existing organizations also isn't enough to get us to where we need to get to.
And a tension there would be, are you organizing people that your member organizations should be organizing? And so you would sort of be competing with them for people.
So a lot of what we have to figure out is how to navigate that. But I do believe there's so much people.
Organizing to do.
There's a lot of people, and like we just need to figure it out. And so I think we've tried to do both. We try to figure out how to get resources to our groups to build their capacity. And I think there's so much in the city and certainly across the state of people who are not organized and who would be ready, who I think are with us if we were actually having those conversations with them.
Yeah.
So I just want to ask one question to both of you, and then we're going to take audience questions. How do you define organizing, and how has it changed over the years?
So organizing is simply making sure that people who are most impacted by an issue have the opportunity to develop a collective strategy to win, right? How do you create change around that issue you're coming together for? And I would say it hasn't changed. I believe that when you look throughout the history of the planet, you see organizing campaigns. I think Saul Alinsky gets credit for being the grandfather, godfather, some father of organizing. Yeah. And I believe he may have codified a lot of things into language that we can use to understand what's happening. But you think about the American Revolution and the organizing that took place that led to eventually a war, not that we're trying to create a war here, but you think about like the Sons of Liberty and how they were able to build a base, lead protests.
What does build a base mean?
Thank you for asking me that question.
We talk about that all the time, but what does it mean?
Another one of those Saul Alinsky isms, right? So the idea of building a base simply means that you're recruiting, right? You're recruiting people who you feel are like-minded in regards to some issue or campaign, but then also you're engaging those people to help build some political education. Right, so it's not that you're not just herding people onto a bus or into a room, but you're helping to develop the understanding that those people have so that they understand why they're being organized, but then they can take it to the next level. So that's the idea of building a base. And so you think about the work that happened where you had, at least the mythology around this, is that you had like 9 people who said, you know what, I'm tired of giving all my money to Britain when I should be able to enjoy as much of it as possible. And then they went and got other owners, right, who said, yeah, we should be able to keep more of our money. That's right. And then all that spread throughout 13 colonies, which is eventually led to the point of Britain having to send soldiers to try to shut it down, right, which led to all these skirmishes, et cetera, right? But the point I'm making is that you think about the abolition of slavery, that was an organizing campaign, right? You think about workers' rights, the idea of the modern workday, the modern work week. These were things that emerged from organizing campaigns, right? The idea of a 40-hour work week, right, with weekends, an 8-hour workday, is a recent innovation, right, that came through the result of organizing campaigns. And so I would say, again, organizing, what it is hasn't changed. What it may look like, to some degree, may have changed. And this is something Ameesha and I talk a lot about, because there's a playbook that's been developed. Again, I think Alinsky played a major role in developing that playbook. But what we've seen happen is, not to get too much into political affiliations, but the right or the owning class in this society have been able to figure out that playbook. And so when we move our X, they move their O, right? And we keep losing. We have to regain the power of our bodies and minds and organize in a way that makes sense for our communities. We don't have to follow someone's playbook if we know what it is that we want. And we have to go after what we want, not just what we think we can win.
Ameesha, if you have anything to add, that'd be great too. And then also just an addendum to my original question is, what makes a good organizer?
Yeah, so when I was a union organizer, there was this senior organizer who scared the hell out of me, who I just she suddenly turned around one day and was like, "What's the job of an organizer?" And I was like, "I don't know." Clearly there's an answer and I don't know what it is. And she was like, "It's to help an individual person connect to their sense of hope and their power. Because if an individual person doesn't feel that they have power, then this idea of collective power means nothing." And then I was like, yeah, I knew that. But I thought that's really a very simple definition, but it's something that's really stayed with me, which is that it is, again, the way that oppression and all of the kind of ways that oppressive society is set up to make us feel like we don't have power and we don't have agency and things are just the way that they are. So for me, the job of an organizer, for me, it's to help have individual people be able to be connected to their sense of power, and then from there to bring people into this idea of collective power and move people into action, collective action. I think the thing that I would maybe just say a little bit differently than Joanna did about how organizing has changed or not changed. I think the biggest role is the role of capitalism in organizing. And so in the US, we have this is a recent phenomenon. It wasn't always true that there were paid organizers like Joanna and myself who were running 5 IRS, vetted organizations that foundations could get, you could give money to me and get some tax break on for doing that. That whole system, kind of what people talk about is the nonprofit industrial complex, is a very Western kind of phenomenon in this period of time. And I think that there's real challenges for us in the US to get to the kind of scale we need to get to if we're committed to that model of organizing, because it always means we never have enough resources to bring about radical change. That's not going to, people have talked about, that's not going to get funded. People who have wealth aren't giving money to me to dismantle capitalism, right? There is limits to our ability to have the resources we need when we have a paid staff model of organizing. And I think globally, it doesn't exist in the same way. I was able to spend a little time in Spain a few months ago, and even in Europe, right? So I'm not even talking about global South, but even in places like Barcelona, where there is a culture of collectivity, but paid organizing staff is an exception rather than a norm. So people are organizing after their day of work, whatever that is, with their kid on their hips, and that's how everyone in the room is. And it's a different idea. And it doesn't mean, I'm not romanticizing that as hey, that's the promised land, but it forces you to have to build independent of thinking that you have enough resources, dollars to be able to do it. And I think that there's definitely folks trying to think about base building and new strategies for organizing new people that are distributive, right? This is a model that Bernie Sanders did in his last election, which is that having a set of volunteers, but then having them do a bunch of work as volunteers, leading house meetings and organizing, canvassing and phone banking, all of that, like I think organizations, I'll speak for myself, like Grassroots Collaborative, many of our organizations are really limited by paid organizing and having money for paid canvasses, and all of that's important, but I think that's a key challenge for if we try to think about the major systemic changes that we need to bring about, we have to figure out new models of how to do that.
Okay. All right, great. Thank you both so much. So we're going to take questions. Is that Chase? I think I see. Yes, hi. All right, so, okay, you guys are on it. You don't, all right, okay, let's go. You're well lined up. Okay.
Hi, my name's Chase. I'm a second year and I'm studying sociology. And I'm a firm believer that policy should be shaped through the people and policies should reflect the needs that people express. However, you oftentimes see policy and law reflect the wants of people in positions of economic, social, and political power and capital rather than those in need. So I was wondering, what are some ways you envision community organizing, policy reform, and law interacting with each other to address these social inequalities and sort of give the power back to the people?
Sort of the question, isn't it? I just want to say we have a lot of people lined up, and so just if you could keep your answers brief, that'd be great. You know, no big deal.
Right.
140 characters.
Yeah, exactly.
That's the idea. So I'll start. I think that's exactly what we do, right? You take an issue that exists and then help the people who are impacted by that issue create policy change, right, to address that issue. And so I think that what we struggle with is all lawmakers making decisions based on either their individual interest or the interest of the bosses, right, the people with all the resources. And so as we engage those people and really put the people who are being hurt by these policies in front of the lawmakers, we get to a position where those lawmakers begin to be more accountable to the constituents they were elected to represent, or the people who are challenging those lawmakers, hold them accountable, eventually take their seat.
Okay, next question. Thank you, Chase.
Hello, thank you all for coming here tonight. My name is Estrella, and I'm a first year in the college. So something that struck me particularly is the point you made about publicly subsidized college education being recast as a radical idea when it's expanded to include people of various classes and races. So I wanted to ask, in what ways can we move this conversation forward and kind of call attention to this implicit discrimination that has made this idea considered radical? Should it be more through conversations or political organizing? And what advice do you have to address that issue?
It's a great question. I think when talking about questions of scale it's really challenging to think about how do you reach the number of people to be able to shift ideas, right? I do think this is a place, so we did a set of focus groups with our leaders around, this bold transformative agenda like 2 years ago, and mostly people didn't think any of it was possible. What they thought was most possible was free college, and that's because you had Bernie Sanders a couple years before that talking about free college, right? And there was, I think that, and we like to think that an individual person, leader, isn't the kind of key thing. But the reality of scale and being able to make ideas that certainly seem like the norm, you need various leaders talking about it in their platforms, because right now the only things being talked about are, again, the opposition messaging. So I think it's really hard. It's work we're trying to do even at the local level, and it's constant work because it's deep political education work. But then the question of how do you reach a larger mass of people around these ideas. I think moments like the Chicago teachers strike are really important moments, because suddenly, kind of ideas that can be painted as again, we don't have resources for it. suddenly in this sort of kind of huge moment of compression, people are like, oh yeah, this makes total sense, and I'm with the teachers. And more parents were with the teachers longer on the strike than in 2012, which I didn't think was going to be possible. But I think it speaks to, again, the power of messaging and having a platform, in addition to, of course, the organizing work we need to do on the ground.
An example that comes to mind on that, in terms of reaching big ideas didn't actually go through a presidential candidate, is...
That'd be great to hear, because that's a hard way to go.
Is $15 an hour,
Oh,
right?
that's
Which
right.
was totally radical, right?
Yep.
We were fighting and not winning on $10.10 an hour,
Yep.
right? Which would still be a huge increase from $7.25, which is what the current federal minimum wage is, and the tipped wage is $2.13. Okay, thank you. Okay, 15 seemed insane. And yet then you had the people who are literally thought of as like the lowest rung job in the economy, fast food workers, going out on strike to demand 15 an hour. And it was really low paid retail and fast food workers who put that on the agenda. So it's not always just the person
That's
at
right.
the top, although that can be a good shortcut.
Hi, thank you for being here. My name is Mallory, and I'm a second-year history major in the college. You kind of touched on how organizing has changed or not changed a little bit earlier, but I was wondering if you could speak to how the growth of social media has changed or not changed, or your organizing work, and specifically, do you see more young people getting involved?
Social media. I mentioned I was 46. I did not grow up with a cell phone in my hand. For us, social media became a critical tool in around 2015. We were in the midst of a hunger strike to get Dyett High School reopened. Dyett High School is one of these case studies in how Chicago Public Schools just either does not work or is an excellent example of how to sabotage communities. It might be a combination of the two. But after Dyett High School began to exceed all expectations, winning awards, et cetera, the Board of Education decided to close the school. The parents decided to organize against it for years, agitating at the local and federal level. And it got to a point where the parents said, we need a Hail Mary. Our school's about to close. Nobody seems to care. We need to do something. And so they launched what became a 34-day hunger strike. For 34 days, these people, it started out with a dozen, weren't eating anything. People were hospitalized, the whole bit, right? There was a media blackout on the hunger strike. We had reporters who were showing up just out of solidarity saying, like, our editor told us we aren't covering this story. You got people starving themselves for a high school, and local media won't carry it, right? And so for us, that's when we took to social media, right? We need to get word out that this is happening. And that began to open the floodgates, because now you have people literally from around the world trying to figure out why the savior, Rahm Emanuel, right, one of the top fundraiser for the Democratic Party nationally, is letting these poor black women starve themselves just because they want a high school built. And it was the first time national media began to question Rahm Emanuel. And I believe it really sort of was the first chink in the armor that eventually was just shattered when Laquan McDonald was murdered on the south side of Chicago. And so that helped us realize how effective social media can be in terms of spreading a message. But we're still novices at really understanding how to utilize it.
Okay, next question, please. Thank you.
Thank you. Sorry, my leg is sprained, my knee. I have a question about positionality and learning when to step up and step back. Sorry if I missed this earlier, but I'm really curious about how, understanding that you may work at an organization that you really hope is organized, like another part of this organization is organized, or this part of this organization changes while you are still within it, and therefore you can't, people in certain shirts may not want to talk to you, but you're like, yo, I need to understand X, Y, and Z in order to advocate within this space. And so like, how do you suggest that people kind of like find different ways to support these efforts while also still encouraging that like storytelling piece to find allies? So it's a question about allyship and learning when to leave, stay, et cetera, et cetera. Thank you.
So I'll say as an organization that is a coalition, it's a constant question that we're engaging with. For me, as someone who's of Asian heritage, organizing in a Black, white, Latino city, it's a kind of constant question that I, on an individual personal level, I'm always navigating in terms of what my role is and how to use the positions and places that I'm in to be able to think about privilege and opening opportunity for folks, and where I need to step back, right? And where I need to be able to make sure that there's other voices in the room. I think organizationally, there's a similar way where I think trying to figure out what role, for example, one of the roles that we played as an ally was around the campaign for against the Cop Academy. So this is, the No Cop Academy was led by primarily Black youth on the west side of the city who are fighting against public dollars going to create a new police academy. For us as an organization, we thought it was really critical to support and back the young people in that effort, but to be clear that it was about lifting up their voices and being able to make, for example, helping to get an editorial board meeting with the Sun-Times or other kinds of things that we did to be able to take the kind of skills and assets that we had to be able to support that effort. But I think we're constantly navigating, I think, obviously we believe everything is connected and it's intersectional, and trying to figure out at what point are we, what's the best use of our energy and time in any given moment, given that there's always more campaigns to take on and more work that we need to do. And I think that's our constant challenge, is figuring out, and I think part of the thing for us and what we're trying to move towards more of is understanding where we are in a longer arc of history, to be able to think about, okay, so what actually is coming up ahead? What are the interventions we need to make to be able to actually continue to build the power that we need? And then, therefore, in our current moment, what are the campaigns we need to be really active on, and what are the ones that we need to step back on? And so I think it's constant, I don't know, I'm sure we make lots of mistakes all the time. It's constant work to kind of keep figuring out what our role is in any given moment, and how to continue to show as many intersections as possible.
Next question.
Hi, thank you both for being here. My name is Izzy. I'm a second-year MPP student, Master in Public Policy student, and also an active member in the Jewish Council on Urban Affairs that's worked with both your organizations in the past. And so given my policy degree right now, I'm thinking, how does policy analysis work into your development of campaigns, work into your development of issues? Joanna's one thing that I'm still learning on this, so I don't know everything, but for example, talking about rent regulations, rent control, when some research has shown that maybe it doesn't have the impact to actually boost the lives, incomes, et cetera, of lower income people. So maybe specifically on rent control, but more, I think I'm more interested in how does policy analysis shape into your campaigns and organizations?
Yeah, no, thank you for that. It's a critical part of it. In our organizing training, policy analysis is one of the, modules that's there, because for us, the trick is really understanding how public policy impacts our everyday life, right? Both ways, right? How it negatively impacts it, how we can change it so it has a better effect on our lives, as well as which lawmaker is responsible for what, right? If we want a stop sign on our block, who do we go to get that done, versus we need more resources in our school, who do we go to get that done, right? So that's, again, a critical part of what we do every single day. Before we launched the rent control campaign, we spent a year, literally a year, researching how it worked in cities across the country. So places that currently had it, we talked to organizers, tenants, lawyers, et cetera, right? Places where they voted against rent control, they had it and decided we don't want to do it anymore. What was the impact in those communities? And in trying to understand how it worked or it didn't work, looking beyond sort of the narrow set of studies that, frankly, the realtors funded, right? To say, okay, if it didn't work, even though the actual studies, when you read them, rent control does work. But if you take the belief that, okay, it's not working, why is it not working? And we were able to identify the loopholes that exist in San Francisco, New York, DC, that allow realtors to exploit the given laws so that you have some of the most unaffordable cities in the country. But when you look at the impact that the rent control units have in those markets, those are often the only places where you have low-income families of color who are able to live, like San Francisco, right? In San Francisco, there's a coalition called the Last 3%. Like, the name of the group is the Last 3%, right? And so those families, like if you haven't seen The Last Black Man in San Francisco, like the nuance in the movie teases some of these things out, right? The people who are left there are people who are in rent control units, who are squatting, or they're couch surfing, right? They're living with people who are in rent control units, or their family historically have been able to own the property there and manage the rent increases and the property tax increases. But it's a critical part of everything that we do, right? You can't create change if you don't know the levers that are being used to oppress us.
Thank you.
Hey, thank you for coming here. My name is Jordan Graham. I'm a first-year MPP student over at Harris. Both of you talked about coalition building, and my question is about kind of what that looks like from the start. You know, when you're trying to make those connections with another like-minded organization or organization where you might agree with what they're doing, you know, is that about two people, you know, coming together like in a room and literally just hashing it out? Like, how do these things start? And then also, what sort of compromises are involved where you might have slightly different visions of the same issue, but you want to come with a cohesive voice?
Great. Let's take the one last question. Is that right? Do you have a question, sir? No. Yes. Yes. Okay. Let's just take that one last question to get them both on the table because we just have a couple minutes left. And yeah.
My name is David Reynolds. One of the things I wanted to say was we can't have failed leadership teaching new leadership. We're going to repeat history, and we're doing it through technology. The other thing I want to say is, what are you guys doing to search out new breakthrough ideas and to evolve organizing?
Okay, thank you.
90 seconds left.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. Sorry, what was the first one?
The first one was, how does it actually look to start a coalition?
Right.
And compromises.
So really, I mean, I think there's certainly a much longer answer, but I think having one-on-one conversations is the root of so much of the organizing we still do. It is about sort of understanding and building relationships, understanding where people are coming from, what motivates them, what they care about, and trying to figure out what are the ways that we could be in motion together. For us at Grassroots Collaborative, shared ideology is really critical. So what's your worldview? How do you think about the world? How do you take action? How do you believe that you can affect change really matters? So it doesn't matter what issue you care about. Honestly, we believe everything's connected, and especially our work on kind of connecting revenue to all of the things that we care about. It's less about the issue, but how do we understand what's our ideology, and is there enough there to actually build something with each other? And I think places where that becomes a challenge in terms of negotiation within coalition spaces, the level of difference in ideology determines really how much can we actually get to stay being in alignment, or where we actually are going to have very different visions and very different endpoints of where we're trying to get to.
And I would just add, necessity is the mother of invention. I think the greatest skill an organizer can develop is the ability to listen through hearing, like actually hearing what it is that people are saying to you, it allows both parties to really understand what's needed to create change.
Beautiful. All right, in order to keep this event on time, we do have to close it there. I just want to say this has been just an extraordinary conversation for me to be a part of. I'm really grateful. I'm sure our audience feels the same way. Just quickly as a final thing, how can anyone listening to the live stream or here in this room get involved with fair tax, with Obama CBA, with the $15 minimum wage, all the great causes that you've talked about?
For us, you can find us online at grassrootscollaborative.org, on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, the social media question earlier. That's a key place of how we are definitely organizing and reaching new people and encourage folks to connect in.
And for COCO, the Kenwood Oakland Community Organization, we're COCO Online, KOCO, online, all one word, .org. You can also reach us the old school way. Our phone number is 773-548-7500, and we're right off the corner of 43rd and Cottage Grove. You're welcome to stop in anytime.
Great, beautiful. Thank you so much.